Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Thank you so much for choosing to listen. And choice is a very relevant word for this episode. If you heard the last episode with Dr Melina Moleskis on decision making, you'll know what's coming next. And if you didn't, don't worry, because you can listen to that after this, part 2 of a series on decision making. My guest this time round is Ben Cattaneo, friend of the show and the founder of the Decision Making Studio, a startup that helps clients to make better decisions. In our discussion, we pick up some of the themes I discussed with Melina and explore others. Since Ben's background is in risk, he hosts the All Things Risk podcast. There's a link to that in the show notes. We explore how, in an uncertain world, making good decisions is absolutely critical. We look at why he's named his company the Decision Making Studio and how decision making requires a focus on human components that can't always easily be quantified. Now, one of the ways that we can learn about decision making is to look at famous examples of it, typically things that have gone wrong. But as Ben explains, the classic MBA case studies that we've all heard of don't always help us because they're often misunderstood, which is why he likes to take less well-known examples which can provide richer insights into the realities of human decision-making. We talk about what those are and how he selects them for his decision reaction videos on the show. You also hear about Ben's focus framework that he uses to help his clients to make better decisions and his thoughts on some of the key factors that go into making good decisions. So please enjoy, as I know you will, my discussion with Ben Cattaneo. It's part 2 of the series on decision-making. Ben, welcome back to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you so much, Christian. It's always a pleasure to catch up with you. And I really look forward to this conversation. I love your podcast, so it's an honor to be back.
Well, look, it's great to have you back. You've been on the show before, a friend of the show, definitively, but you've been doing quite a few things since we last had you on. You've set up the Decision Making Studio. Tell us a bit about that.
Sure. So this is my venture. This is my life now, is the Decision Making Studio, which is my consultancy that I set up, and partly inspired by many things, one of which is your work in human risk, but setting up a company of one. And it's all about helping individuals and organizations make great decisions under uncertainty. And if you talk to people in leadership positions and you ask them, have you ever had any leadership training? And they'll probably say, yes, I have. And then you say, well, have you ever had any training on decision making? They probably will say no. And that really struck me as a big problem. And it's one that I set out to try and correct. And that's been my life for the last 6-7 months. Also co-written a book. I've continued with the All Things Risk podcast. There's a lot going on.
And so tell us, you call it a studio, and I'm intrigued why, because obviously, when I think of decision making in studios, I can think of artists making decisions as to what they do. I might think of movie studios. Why did you pick that word?
Very deliberately, because decision making is art and science, I think, and I integrate both of these things. And there's a thing called decision science, and if you start to poke around there, you see some good stuff, but it's all very quantitative. It's almost, the presumption is that we can quantify everything and we can put it into some sort of algorithm and come up with the right answer of the right decision. But decisions don't work like that. We're all very different. We all have different values and different experiences, different human experiences. We therefore need to decide like human beings. And so it is a bit of an art. And studio is, I think, the right word for it, because we bring together lots of different factors from one's values, as well as there's a lot of behavioral science in what I do, but there's also some analytical techniques. And I work with clients and we pick apart the decision. We try it in different ways. It's a studio. And at the end of the day, what I want are clients that are calm and confident about the decisions that they make, not necessarily because they're going to always work out. No one can guarantee that, but because it's the right decision for them and it's the right practice for them as well. It's another important word, is practice. A decision-making process is not a process, a practice. It's something that we need to go back to, and it's great to understand intellectually, but that's not enough. And so there's a lot there, but that's that's the origin of the studio, where I even have a thing called the decision canvas. So we sit down, we kind of like walk it through, and we put different things together, and we can remove things, and it's deciding like a human being.
Love it. One of the things that's really interesting about your approach is what you're not doing is the classic thing that we see often, which is there's a lot of let's show people bad decisions that have been made in the
Yeah.
past, and we can all think of those kind of
Yeah.
MBA case studies that get rolled
Sure.
out. It's not this
Mm,
let's review Nokia's failure or let's review Blockbuster's
mm,
failure. You're actually
mm,
teaching people something different, and I really like the fact that you've moved away from that world of those case studies where I
mm.
think people often read into them what they will.
There are too many of those that are around, and no one was in the room at the time that those decisions were made, so no one really knows. And I actually go in the opposite direction to an extent. I've recently launched a thing called the Decision Navigators course, and I had my first cohort last week. And actually, we used one of those case studies as almost a reverse example, and it was the Blockbuster Netflix case
Do you
in
want to
which everyone
just rehearse just
sure,
in case somebody's not
just
heard
in
it? Give
case
us a
someone
quick
was like, yeah,
synopsis.
sure, sure. So you don't have to go very far to find this. You Blockbuster in the year 2000
So
had
this is let's go back to what Blockbuster
sure,
was.
yeah. So what was Blockbuster was a place where it was massive. So you video rental store chain, it had a very iconic logo, a yellow on blue logo that I guess signified a VHS tape or the box of a rental. You go physically into the store, you say, I want to, they've got, I don't know, 2 dozen copies of what was Meet the Fockers or something on, whatever was popular in the year 1998 or something, The Matrix. And you go and you rent your DVD and you take it home and you watch it and you bring it back. VHS times, you had to rewind the damn thing. So, I mean, anyone who knows how to rewind, that's your true. Have you ever come across Des Bishop? Do you know who he is?
No.
Comedian. He's this Irish Canadian. I think he's Irish Canadian or Irish American comedian. So this little tangent, but he talks about true mindfulness. And he grew up before the digital age, as I did as well. And you didn't have a phone, and if you were on a bus, you were on a bus watching condensation drip is his line, and that's mindfulness. But you also, if you had a VHS tape, you had to rewind it, and that's real mindfulness. So if you ever had to rewind anything, anyway, so these are the kinds of things you had to do if you went to Blockbuster, and they were the dominant player at the end of last century into the early 2000s, and they were all over the place. And in the year 2000, there was a little upstart called Netflix. Now, at the time, Netflix didn't do streaming. Like, there was nothing to stream, right? What was there to stream? There was nothing to stream. So what their business model was, instead of going to a physical store, you can get your DVDs via the post. So you order online what you wanted to watch, and they send it to you, and then you send them back. They give you a little envelope. There was no streaming at the time, and so it was the year 2000. Blockbuster had the opportunity to buy Netflix for $50 million at the time, early 2000, by the way, before the dot-com bubble. And so if you read this case study now, as we know, so Blockbuster eventually went bankrupt. They didn't catch on to the streaming thing, and they went out of business. And Netflix, we know what Netflix is. So the common way in which this case is portrayed is that, wasn't Blockbuster really stupid for not buying Netflix for $50 million in the year 2000, early 2000? And it's a lazy way of looking at it, because it shows all of, or many of, the big decision making traps, which is we have to judge a decision based on what was known at the time. And what was known at the time was Netflix had a business model that certainly wasn't streaming, and they were losing money, and there was streaming wasn't even a thing. Blockbuster was the dominant player, and this was a few months before the dot-com crash. So all the valuations were just out of kilter. We had this thing called Bed Bath and Beyond, and Pets.com, all these companies. And in fact, the Netflix CEO at the time saw that there was overvaluation going on, And so they turned it down. So they didn't buy Netflix. And so the common refrain is, oh, well, they were so stupid. Look at Netflix now. But actually, if we look at the decision at the time, we can say, yeah, that was a pretty good decision to turn it down. And even if they bought Netflix, there's no certainty that Blockbuster would have turned around and like turned it into a streaming business. Netflix might have like just gone under, and Netflix might not have pivoted to streaming from their old business model of mailing DVDs. So there's certainly no way of saying that if they had bought it, it would have worked out. And we might not have Netflix today. I mean, we probably would have streaming, but it might not be Netflix. It might be someone else. So it's a very lazy way of doing decisions. And I bring that right at the beginning of the course to kind of shock people into, oh, this is a little different. But in fact, if you look at the valuation charts and you look at the year 2000, you can see Blockbuster way up here, Netflix down here, and made sense for them to turn it down at the time. So we have to think a little differently about decision making. And this is the message that I keep coming back to is we need to think about making the best possible decision when we make it. That's the core of great decision making. And there's a lot that goes into that. And it's a practice, and we get it wrong a lot, or there are lots of ways in which we can get it wrong. But if we keep coming back to that practice, we're not going to get every single decision right. But over time, those will compound, they will add up, and we'll get more of what we want out of life. And whatever that is, because what I want is maybe different from what you want. I want to ride my bike a lot. Maybe you don't want to ride a bike for, 5-6 hours a day. That might not be fun for you, but that's for me, that's something I like. So we're all very different, and we need to integrate that sort of humanity into the way in which we look at decisions. So it's actually a very involved thing, but when we get it right, I think it's a recipe for quite a lot of personal and organizational success and fulfillment.
And I love the fact that you're taking these traditional case studies and just kind of going, they're not often it's they're not telling you what you think they're telling you. And I'm guilty of this sometimes as well myself, is this kind of, look at these idiots that did something
Yeah.
stupid.
Yeah.
And of
Yeah.
course, there are plenty of examples of people that are idiots that did do stupid things, and that
Mm,
we can all be idiots on some level.
mm,
But I love this idea that you're taking that and going, let's just actually have a look at what happened, and let's recognize. I think implicit in what you're doing. Correct me if this is wrong, but implicit in the decision making process is saying actually we're not going to get everything right. We're going to get some things wrong. So what we're trying to do here, I think, is to put ourselves in the strongest position to make the best possible
mm,
decisions, and that doesn't mean
mm,
100% track record of calling
mm,
everything right. It means making the best decision with the
mhm,
information that was
mhm,
available to you at the time. And
yeah,
I think implicitly, therefore, acknowledging sometimes things are going to go wrong. And we have to accept
mhm,
the fact that we will,
mhm,
with hindsight, we would have made different decisions. But hindsight's a wonderful thing that's not available to us at the time we're making the
yeah.
decision.
Yeah, I think the thing that we're going for is if we were presented with the same circumstances again, we'd make the same decision, even if that didn't work out. That's the kind of thing we're going for. And as you say, it's really hard to get that right all the time. And we're never going to get 100% track record on successful decisions. That just, even if we took the decision perfectly, that would never be possible. In fact, that would probably be an indication of something going wrong. Like either you're cheating or you're not doing something right, or you're getting extremely lucky. It's not possible. The best thing that we can ever do is to make the best decision we can at the time. And there's so many aspects to it that we can't. So well, often people think, well, this is all about analyzing to, to the nth degree every single decision. Well, no, you can't do that. And I think you've used it, James Clear's hats, haircuts, tattoos thing. Just some decisions are like hats, you can take them off. Some of them are like haircuts where you might have to wait a little while if you get a bad haircut or pay for a haircut again. And then some are tattoos where they are irreversible and we need to slow down. Well, most of the decisions we make are hats, right? Or maybe haircuts. Very few of them are sort of life changing sliding doors things. And so it's actually not about that. In fact, a lot of the time it's when I talk to clients, it's about recognizing, no, you can speed up. It's fine. If this doesn't work out, that's fine. Now you've learned something. There's actually a lot of decisions where the only way you can get the knowledge is by trying it and failing and seeing, oh yeah, that's an interesting insight. We wouldn't have known that if we hadn't tried that. So it's a very different way of thinking about the world. And as you say, those case studies and people being idiots and so forth. Well, we're all human beings. So we'll get a few things wrong here and there. And that's just that's part of it. So we just have to recognize that and incorporate it. Good decision making incorporates our humanness, our humanity into the process and the practice.
And I love when you talk about it in that way. You're really looking at decision making is about it's similar to the, and I know your background is in risk and your
Mhm.
podcast, the All
Yeah.
Things Risk
Yeah.
podcast, link to that in the show notes.
Yeah. Mm.
What's interesting about that is people often think, well, risk is let's not take any risk. Right? But you
Mm.
have to take risk in order to make money or
Mm.
to succeed in life, right?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think what's interesting about decisions is that it's tied into that same mentality
Mm.
often of, well, we need to reduce risk and take let's make
Mm.
smart decisions. And I think what you're
Yeah.
doing is saying, actually, let's think in the same way the risk isn't about not doing things
Yeah.
and being careful. Risk is about
Mm.
intelligently navigating the world and making
Mhm.
sure that you don't do, you don't want to do really obviously stupid things, but you have to
Mhm.
recognize that some things aren't going to work out. You're taking that into the decision making sphere and really saying, look, actually,
Mm.
back to your studio thing, there's an art to this,
Yes.
and
Mm.
we're navigating things. And often there isn't a right answer, right? There
Yeah.
are trade offs
Mm.
involved in all of these things. And so, of course,
Yeah.
sometimes there are obvious things where you would go, there
Mm.
is one course of action that makes sense, right? And that's the best
Mm.
possible. But in
Mm.
most cases where we have any sense of
Mm.
dilemma, we're weighing up different factors. And that's where I
Yeah.
think this risk mindset that you bring and this artistic thinking, I think plays into it because it
Yes.
recognizes the
Yeah.
complexities of the world that we're in. It's not the world we'd like to live in, which would be a simple one with easy. We're in a complicated world with competing
We are. We are.
propositions. And as you say, we're all
Mm.
different.
Mm. I have grown to really dislike the word risk now, even though I named my podcast that. I want to rebrand. Um, Not because it's necessarily a bad word, but it's become very tainted. The brand is not worked very well. It has a negative connotation. And I love how, and I'm going to have a little go at the sort of risk industry here, but you have the risk profession has kind of gotten into this space of, well, risks are also opportunities, right? So there's negative risk and there's positive risk. So yeah, but if you look at the dictionary definition, it really talks about, bad things that could go wrong. And that's how most people understand it. So we can say, well, wait a minute, there's opportunity. It's not just risk, there's opportunity. I find that to be a bit of a gimmick. Um, Often, and I'm not talking about a person here, but if the risk profession was a person, it'd be someone that has a serious complex, right? So someone that's, really crying out for relevance and saying, oh, we would talk about opportunity as well. And I much prefer the word uncertainty. It captures the world so much better. And uncertainty is something I use in my frameworks called focus, right? But you couldn't replace the U with an R. So partly, the U stands for uncertainty in focus, but there's a very deliberate reason for that is that the world is uncertain. You can't know all the factors. The difference between risk and uncertainty is risk. We have some sort of knowledge of what might happen, what the consequences might be, and or we can estimate that. But uncertainty, you can't. That there are things that could happen, and that's increasingly the world in which we live and we have to navigate. And that does mean if you're an organization, you have to make some trade-offs. There's going to be some complex trade-offs. You can't do everything. That's what strategic planning is all about, and I had Allison Taylor on my podcast, who I know you've had, and her book is all about doing the right thing. And her point is that you can't do everything as an organization. Doing the right thing means choosing not to do certain things. And that's exactly the same with a strategy. We have trade-offs to make. So that's at an organizational level, that can feel difficult and constricting, but that's what leaders should be, paid the big bucks to do, is to make those difficult calls. And we should be rewarding and incentivizing leaders for making good quality decisions, not necessarily for the right outcomes. Um, Over time, good decisions add up and you get more of the right outcomes, but you don't, it's not a linear process. You might need to wait a while, or you might need to take a step back when you're getting quite a lot of good outcomes at the beginning. That might be something that isn't going to last. But individually as well, that means that there are multiple answers. There's no one right answer. There's multiple ways of doing things. There are multiple ways of learning, and that's something that we have to embrace. That's kind of leaning into the uncertainty. The world is increasingly uncertain. We're not going to be able to map everything out. We're not going to. We can't. We need to stop this pretending that we can map all the cause and effect relationships of absolutely everything. We cannot. Right? That isn't something that is even possible. So we need to let go of that and embrace this idea of leaning into the uncertainty that some of those things are going to maybe not work out, but over time, A, you're going to feel, more calm and more confident. And B, over time, you're going to get closer to what you want to be, whatever you want to do.
And I think this, well, what really intrigues me about your approach is you're looking and saying, I'm going to help you navigate this thing. I'm not going to provide certainty. And so where I think that the difference between what you described, some of those traditional approaches,
Mm.
let's get all the numbers, punch them
Yeah.
into a model. We will
Yeah.
quantify what the best outcome
Mm.
is. And we'll
Mm.
use some kind of complicated model that nobody else but the risk people
Yeah.
understand to get
Yeah.
a number, and we'll compare that number with the other number, and whichever number, depending on whether we want a high number to be
Mm.
higher or lower, that's the answer. And
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
basically
Or, Mhm.
gone.
Yeah. Or this distribution or that distribution, I can hear people shouting into my proverbial ear, saying, "No, no, it's not a single number; it's a
Right,
range. It's
right,
it's just what it's like. Okay, shut up.
right.
It's like it's whenever we attribute a number to something, we're involved, right? So it's very hard to remove it's impossible to remove the observer from the number. So there's always these quantitative tools are very useful, but they are tools and they can be helpful, but they also have limitations. It's just like biases in algorithms, right? That we know there are biases, there are human biases in algorithms, AI algorithms, machine learning, all of these things. And it's the same when we attribute numbers to things. It gives us potentially a false sense of security that we can do all this computation and it gives us the answer or what have you. It's helpful, but there are huge limitations. And you can never get away from the fact that we have values and different objectives and goals in life. And we have to do a lot of work to figure out what those are. And if we do that, as I said, we'll get closer to the kinds of things that we want. But there's, there's no right answer. There's no right. This is the thing we have to let go is the concept of right answer or wrong answer.
And I love the fact you're giving people just confidence in this space, right? And what's I think is really interesting
Mm,
about decision making is on the one hand, we're all capable of it because we have to. We made on the
mm,
other hand, we're not necessarily that good at it. And so I think
mm,
what the way I see what you're doing, and I'd be interested in your perspective on this, is really sort of saying, okay, here's
mm.
something whether you like it or not, you're going to have to make decisions on a
Yeah.
on a daily whatever and it's
Mm,
minute by minute basis in some cases. I've got to
mm,
decide what questions I ask you. You've got to
mm,
decide whether or not you want to answer
mm.
them and how you want to
Yeah.
answer them.
Yeah.
And so as we're doing that, I think you're giving people a way of thinking about here's how to be
Mm,
better at this skill that
mm,
of course we can all intuitively do, but do we necessarily do it well? And I think we'd like to think
mm,
we do. But back to your point around what
mm,
people are trained in, often it's almost been presumed
mm,
we've picked it up. And so you're saying, let's step back and here's something you do on a minute by minute basis. Sometimes it's
mhm.
significant, sometimes it's less significant. And
Yep.
let's give people a guide for how to do that better. Is that the right way to
Yeah.
look at it?
I absolutely. We make 35,000 decisions a day. That's an inordinate amount. Most of the time, we're not even noticing the decisions that we make. And then when we start to notice, that's when we start to run into some problems because we think we can control for all these variables. I'll walk through my framework if that's
Yeah.
helpful because I created a framework called Focus. It covers a whole range of stuff that goes into good quality decision making. I thought focus is a catchy, memorable word. You could use another word. It's fine by me, but as long as it kind of captures all of the things that are in each of these five elements. But the idea is you can kind of walk through mentally in a few minutes whenever catch yourself pausing and thinking about, well, is this the right decision or not? And then maybe spend a bit of time if you catch yourself thinking, oh, well, this is kind of important, we might need to deep dive into one thing or the other, then you can do that. or you could turn this into a big, involved process, which I don't recommend on a regular basis. I think that's useful for certain highly irreversible, big stakes decisions. But basically, focus stands for framing, options, cognitive biases, uncertainty, and selection. And so the idea is for framing, it's about making sure that you have the right frame, meaning, are we clear about the objectives behind this decision? Are we clear whether or not this aligns with our values? Sometimes you can just look at something and say, oh, I'd never do that. This violates one of my core values. And that's it. We stop. Um, Options is all about having the right amount of options, not too many and not too few. It's just trying to avoid the sort of, it, it could be what to watch on Netflix. Netflix again. I could spend 45 minutes just scrolling through what to possibly watch, what's being recommended to me. And then it's like, oh shit, I've used a
That
good
was my entertainment.
third of my, yeah, a good third of my evening now. And how to get through that. Or businesses do the other thing, which is this either or fallacy, this either or thing, which is like, we have a big business case. We need to figure out whether to fund this investment or not, as opposed to thinking about, well, how else could we do this thing? So this is an interesting case study. If you look at, I know you had Bent Flyberg on your show, and he talks about the difference between the Bilbao Guggenheim versus the Sydney Opera House. And in the Sydney Opera House example, the authorities fell in love with the image. They wanted to have a cool building. They kind of got enamored with a beautiful drawing, as opposed to why they wanted to do the thing in the first place. So they didn't actually frame it very well. And then they didn't actually think about different ways to achieve whatever it is that they wanted. They got those two things wrong. So options are, it's a very important step. It doesn't have to take a huge amount of time. Just ask yourself, is there another way I could do this? And that might open up some possibilities. And also there's a difference between, I like to bring, so going back to the art thing, there's creative divergent thinking and there's the very narrow convergent thinking. And when we're thinking about possibilities, we need to get creative, right? We need to, and we're often not in that space. We're often rushed, or we're in an organizational context and we're thinking very narrowly about how to solve a specific problem. But sometimes, that thing of taking a walk and all of a sudden, oh, I've got a new idea, doing those kinds of things can really open up your world. And that's a lot of good stuff there in options about how to get creative when you're in that sort of stuck, that kind of like, oh, I don't know how to get through this. Looking and just taking a premise and taking it to absurd conclusions, even if that's just, you're just playing with the idea. That process might reveal some things that you haven't thought about before. And so that's a creative process. That's not something that you're going to get from an algorithm or from a software tool, or, doing a search on Chat GPT or whatever prompt, or prompting Chat GPT or whatever. Maybe I don't know. I haven't experienced Chat GPT giving me good creative options before. The C is cognitive biases and also human factors. So cognitive biases, all the stuff that very well around biases, and then debiasing and the different debiasing techniques that are out there, or nudges or human risk kind of stuff, but also the physical and emotional states that we're in and how that might play a role in making bad decisions. So that's what's in the C part. And the little acronym, it's trite, but HALT: hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Don't make a decision if you're in any of these states. The U is the uncertainty part. And that is thinking probabilistically, knowing that there's a chance that I'll get what I want, but there's also a chance that I won't. And we think about probability as a mathematical problem, and I teach it as it's an emotional problem. So, if there's an 80% chance of a sunny day, or 20% chance of rain, and you get the 20%, that doesn't mean that the forecast was wrong, right? There's a chance that it doesn't work out, and we have to get comfortable with that. It's an emotional problem. It's a mathematical problem. That's how it's often taught. And there are mathematical tools and everything. And I've done all of them and I can teach them, but it's at the heart of it, uncertainty is also an emotional problem. And then we get to the S, which is once you've done that sort of work, and again, you can kind of mentally just ask yourself these questions. We choose something and we don't reopen it. You don't reopen a decision that you've done the work around. We also do that a lot. We second guess ourselves. Organizations do this all the time. It's not very healthy. So it's better to just decide something, go ahead, do it, and then you can take a step back and see if what did you learn? And so that's really the overall framework, and it underpins a lot of the work that I do with clients, because you have to have a way of, as you say, there are people who talk about how stupid we are and all the decision making traps and everything, but what does a good decision look like? And that's what that framework aims to do. There are other frameworks, but you can remember that. You can remember focus.
Really, I think what you're saying here is helpful in the sense of putting people at ease with things, because I think decisions, as you say, things are going to go for us, things are going to go, there's going to be brilliant decisions, and then the world
Mhm.
changes, and actually a presumption that
Yeah.
we made that was valid at the time is
Mhm.
no longer valid.
Mhm.
There can be things that just through sheer luck we succeed. We know
Mhm.
all these. And so, really, what you're doing is giving people a compass, a kind of guide, a way of thinking about it, so that
Mm.
I guess so that you can sleep at night, right? So that you've thought
Yeah.
about the reasons you might get it wrong. And
Mm.
we haven't necessarily optimized in every single way that we can, because that may not
Mm.
be possible. But
Mm.
we've thought about things that might be relevant factors. And therefore, we've come out with what ought to be a
Mm.
better decision, not necessarily
Mm.
the winning decision, not necessarily the one, but a better decision than we would have made if we hadn't
Mm.
considered some of those factors.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing I keep coming back to is I want to make sure that people are calm and confident about the decision they're making. That's the idea. This is about not guaranteeing success, but being calm and confident about what you've decided to do. And you mentioned compass. The logo of the decision making studio is sort of a compass with a kind of hand drawn circle around it. I love the saying that it's better to have a compass rather than a map, and that's part of the ethos around framing. Actually, is having a good compass rather than a map. A map could be wrong, and uh, knowing that we've made the best possible decision when we made it. That's all you can. That's all you can do. Now, there are times when you have to really zero in and dive in and make sure and spend maybe several weeks, talk to lots of people, consult lots of sources of information. If you're making a really big, important decision that is quite irreversible, if you're making a big multi-billion-dollar investment decision, if you're a company, or I wouldn't recommend doing this for a decision around getting married in terms of putting that into a big complex model. But you do want to talk to your future spouse about lots of things to make sure that attitudes about money and children, and you don't want to go into it lightly. And so, depending on the type of decision, you can dive into any of these five things and go into the right amount of detail. At some point, you're going to have to stop and you're going to have to decide. And there's always an element of uncertainty and going into the unknown when we decide. And I think we have to get comfortable at recognizing that, because you can't control for everything.
And I really like that recognition that we're never going to have perfect information,
Mm.
in part
Yeah.
because actually, even if we had it, there's something that
Yeah.
could happen seconds later
Yeah.
that could
Absolutely.
undermine that. And so you talk a lot about uncertainties in the framework. I love this idea
Mhm.
of recognize that's a feature, and we can
Mm.
wish it away as much as we want,
Mm.
but
It's a feature of the world. Yeah, it's a feature of the world in which we live. And I do talk about this thing called the zone of regret versus zone of disappointment an awful lot, which is we know what the downsides might be, and if it doesn't work out, we were disappointed. But we kind of knew that going into it, versus the zone of regret where you missed something you probably shouldn't have missed, and you did something you probably should have known you shouldn't have done. That's very different. But that's almost in some ways the best you can do. But also that's the isn't that the beauty of life, right? If everything was all predictable and we knew it was going to happen, then why bother? If you knew what the final score was going to be of the cup final, or the election, or the end of your mystery novel or whatever, then what
what's the point, right?
what's the point, right? So we have to lean into the uncertainty. That the uncertainty is kind of like, it's almost like the fuel of life. We tend to forget that. And we tend to shy away from activities that lean into that, like just playing, right? Or experimenting, innovating, just trying new things. And we need an awful lot more of that. And, good decision making also incorporates that. And sometimes the uncertainty is things go far better than you even imagined. And you wouldn't have known that if you hadn't tried. And so I think we need to think differently about the world, and that I think that starts with quality decision making, because we talk about the world being more complex and uncertain, and it is true. It's harder to make good decisions, and the more that we get rid of this thinking that we can control for all the variables and predict the future, the the better that we'll all be.
Love that. And there's a weird thing, right, where we simultaneously want certainty and excitement.
Mm,
And so certainty makes our lives easier. Excitement makes it, just like
mm.
that brings it with this adrenaline
Yeah,
rush there. And I think it's
yeah, yeah.
fascinating that we have this trade-off where, of course, there are we do want predictability in terms of
Mm,
things like the law. I want to
mm.
know that if I show up to the train station, the train is going to
Yeah.
arrive. That it's going to go to where I want
Mhm.
it to go. It's going to get me there on time. All those sorts of things. But we
Yeah.
equally need. I wouldn't want all of my life to be like that. And so I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
there's this. It's a really important thing to acknowledge, because I do think a lot of decision making. Back to those famous case studies. It's
Mm,
like, well, look at these idiots, right? It was
mm,
clearly dot dot
mm,
dot, and it wasn't clear at the time. And actually, some of
mm.
it is about taking risks and gambles. And of course, there's the whole, and this is why I love when you bring cognitive biases in. It's about, we select our case that we haven't heard about
Yes.
tons of other cases. We haven't heard about
Yeah.
all the other decisions the blockbuster took. They may have,
Yes.
made some amazing decisions that we never
Mm,
found out about, that actually the business
mm.
could have died a long, long time before if they hadn't done that. And so,
Yeah.
it's this combination of these two things. And I think what you're doing is really exposing in the decision making thing is disposing the honesty about what we have to go through and the things that we need
Mm.
to think about and what might impact that and our perceptions of it.
Yeah, and you mentioned, certainty, and there's also a feeling that we need to. You can go the other direction and say, "Well, we need to everything. Let's just lean into uncertainty all the time," and that's also not that's also not healthy. That we learn by linking what we don't know with what we do know. That's how you learn a new language, for example. Oh, that's this word. Oh, that sounds like this word. And you start to put the pieces together, and that's how we learn anything. So we do need to have that balance of understanding what it is, what we're certain of, and that could also be things like our values and our objectives. There are some things that whenever we're even going on an adventure, you need to know. I've spoken to a woman by the name of Paula Reed who cycled across Ukraine. My latest podcast on all things risk, and well, you need to know that your bike's going to work. Right? You need to know how you're going to. You need to know a bunch of things, right? That you need some certainties going into that. So it's not this sort of binary thing of certainties are bad and uncertainties are good, or the vice versa. It's linking things in a way that makes sense to you. And so in decision making, having a good sense of values and objectives and all that stuff that I talk about in framing is incredibly valuable. And then you can do things. You can do things that you might not have thought about. So it's not nothing's binary in good decision making. It's about bringing the right things in and putting it together. Kind of like a work of art, like seeing how the colors fit together and how the textures and trying things out. And when you do that well, it's you know that you're on the right path or not.
And we talked about the MBA case studies that have been the hackneyed case
Mm,
studies that have been loads of
yeah,
time. One of the things that you've
yeah,
been doing that I really like is you've been taking less
mm,
well-known decisions and you've analyzed them. You've done these great videos where you've kind of dissected decisions from
right,
from the movies versus others. Talk a
mm,
little bit about that
mm,
construct. Maybe give us an example of something,
yeah,
because I thought that was a really nice way of bringing this to life without resorting to some of
mm,
the
mm,
greatest hits of risk management or decision.
yeah, yeah. So these are videos called decision reactions, and what I've taken some inspiration from some YouTube accounts that I like in completely different fields, where they watch something and they sort of break it down or offer their reactions. And so what I do is I look at a decision and I say, well, this was a whether or not it was a quality decision is basically what I do. And I've started to do this sort of initially I've gone through my 5 focus things and I've given it a rating out of 5. I think I might get away from that because it doesn't always neatly fall into that and makes the videos kind of potentially kind of long. But I've looked at the movie Moneyball, for example. I've looked at this artist in Denmark who was paid a lot of money to do a bit of art, and it's something he basically didn't produce. He produced a blank canvas, and so the question is, was that a good decision? And things of that nature. Some old movies, a movie that I really liked growing up called Gung Ho with Michael Keaton that everyone seems to have forgotten about, which is a Japanese car firm invests in
Yeah, I hadn't heard of this
Pennsylvania.
at
And it was
all until
yeah,
you told me, but I loved what you looked at because so we'll put a link again to that and your video in the show notes. But there's a really good example, something that
mhm,
has, I guess, it's resonated with you, right? You've remembered it from way back
yeah,
when, so it's sort of straight. It's a case study that you've identified through your,
yeah.
I guess, movie watching, for want of a better phrase.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah. When I was a kid, yeah, we had cable television, and they would show a few movies every month on repeat, and this is one of the ones that I remember. And yeah, that decision was the American workers agreed to break the record for most cars produced in a month, and so the question was, was that a good decision or not? And bad decision making drives good Hollywood movies, right? So so it's a good, it's fertile ground. And the idea isn't I'm not looking at the outcome. I want to break down the decision making process and what was good, what was not so good, and link them back to the focus principles. And then the next one is going to be a friend of mine, Mark Gilmore, who cycled across Morocco in a big race, and he got injured, and he decided to halfway through to pull out of the race. And so was that a good decision or not? And most people will be thinking, oh yeah, of course I would, he's got injured and he's thinking about, riding halfway across Morocco. Like what the hell? It's like, well, wait a minute. He trained, he prepared, he booked travel, it's emotionally, it's not an easy thing to do when you're halfway through a big endeavor like that. So how did he do it is it's impressive. So things of that nature. And I just want to get this idea of decision quality, decision quality, decision quality, decision quality. I want to almost create a decision quality revolution in the world where we're just thinking about decision quality. And if we can do that, the world's just a far better place. And these videos are there to help do that, to spot whether or not something was a good quality decision.
and
And it's not easy.
I love the way you're saying that's changed the world, because actually, when we think about how decision making is judged, and whether that's the
Mm.
media or whether that's these case studies we've
Yeah.
talked about, it's always in that kind of massive
Yeah.
amounts of hindsight bias being
Yeah.
used, and very little looking at the
Mm.
mechanics or the information that was known at the
Yeah.
time or the other
Mm.
constraints that might have been present. And of course, you don't know what the alternative courses of action were, right? It's
Mm.
judging by
Yeah.
that one thing that they decided
Yeah.
to do or not do, as opposed to the other that they could have done. And so, what I like is when you
Yeah.
analyze these situations, is you're going back
Mm.
and it's almost slowing the world down a little bit and saying, let's have a look at what is
Mm.
going on in the moment.
Mm.
That's the bit
Mhm.
that's missing from these case studies. And so I like that way of thinking about it, because like any
Mm.
skill that we want to perfect, that might be,
Mm.
it might be cycling to improve your technique at something. We
Mm.
need to kind of slow the world down a bit and look and pick
Yeah.
apart the bits and practice those bits for the
Mm.
whole to succeed. And so I like this idea of you
Yeah.
taking something that we intuitively think we all understand, we need to get better at. Let's just unpick. Let's almost open the box as to what's going on,
Mm.
slow the world down a bit, have a look, and then we can start to learn about where we could improve it ourselves.
Yeah, it's a practice, Christian. It's not something that we're going to just understand intellectually and then be able to apply it, right? You have to keep coming back. It's like going to the gym. You've got to keep going to the gym to stay fit. So we have to continually stay conscious about how we're making our decisions. And over time, those will add up, they'll compound, but we mustn't forget it and mustn't think this is the problem. I think with decision making is we might read something and then think, oh yeah, that makes sense. I get that. And then just, completely forget about it later on. And you see this all the time. I mean, just pick up the sports pages on a Monday, and there's always something about some decision a manager made that was, that went horribly wrong. Or in organizations, you get some, that managing director who just so happened to preside over a short-term, spike in demand, and all of a sudden everyone's lauding him as a genius and he gets promoted. And I'm thinking it's a he. It's just probably appropriate, probably more common. And we just need to recognize the decision from the circumstance, the outcome from the decision. And we need to look at the decision in the midst of the circumstance.
And as you've been looking at this stuff with your clients, but also
Hmm.
how has it changed you as a decision maker? Because
Huh.
one of the things
Sure.
I've
Yeah.
found with, it's almost, I have this challenge of sort of, I look at my compliance and the wild stuff is I'm constantly
Mm,
looking out for this stuff and it's exhausting.
mm,
And I
yeah.
feel like firstly, I ought to be spotting everyone to be really good at this stuff because I'm focusing on
Mm,
it. But can be all consuming. And I
mm,
wondered, how's that been for you? I guess let's ask a
yeah.
direct question. Is the quality of your decision making
Mm.
improving, or are you recognizing it's a much harder discipline than you might have initially thought? How's that journey been?
Well, a few observations. First of all, just in my interactions with clients, I will say something about my interactions with clients, but I think that also says something about ourselves. When I speak to senior decision makers, they think they understand this really well. And it's actually really hard to convince them otherwise. But then they think, well, my team, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. So
Not
you
for
might
me,
want,
but for these idiots
yeah,
I've hired.
which is really interesting. So my initial traction is really around training, which is interesting. And the folks who tend to have a little bit more humility about them aren't the most senior people, which is, I think that's really interesting. I think sometimes senior leaders would feel like they have to project an image of all being all knowing, and that's not the case. I think there's a lot of work to be done there because humility is in short supply, and good decision making is about humility. It's about understanding, what we don't understand. It's about letting go. It's about making the best possible decision, knowing it doesn't always work out. All of these things. So that's been a very interesting observation, and it's affected my own decision making around my business. But I've also recognized that I've had to think about the human side of it for me a lot more. I've had to keep coming back to, well, why am I doing this? Like, why, you get really absorbed in trying to do certain things, trying to grow a business. As you know, it's very involved and you can get carried away. Right. And then you need to, I found I need to sort of take these moments where I stop and think, well, why am I doing this? Like and remember why you're doing it and then coming back to it. Then I often have had to say, yeah, this is why I'm doing this. I want to do this type of work for these types of clients. And no, I'm not going to go after, for example, external funding or whatever might get thrown at me, and just come back to the purpose and the values. I've had to do a lot more than when I was, say, an employee. And that's helped me, but I've had to come back to it an awful lot. And the other thing is just that sort of the mind body thing of just taking care of my own mental and physical health and stay active and these kinds of things, because when you work for yourself, you can always work and you can get carried away. So those are initially the things that I've taken away. And I think it's valuable to go back to your why and your purpose, and it's incredibly powerful, but I've had to keep coming back to it. So that's a practice. So those have been my initial experiences with it. So I'm not sure if it's changed me. I've doubled down on a few things. I also look at the world, and the more I look at clients, the more I look at what's being written, the more I look at my LinkedIn feed, I keep thinking, "Jeez, we don't understand this. People do not understand this." And those words decision making show up in, LinkedIn posts an awful lot without any understanding of what that actually means. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, no, totally,
Mhm. Mm,
absolutely. And
mm,
you talk there about, getting out, getting exercise, all those
yeah.
sorts of things that we
Mm,
know are good for mental health, and there's more
yeah.
awareness around that as well. Look after yourself physically if you want to be mentally,
Mm,
all those sorts of things. But one of the things that is interesting is that a lot of that sort of thinking, a lot of the things that might go into making a good decision are actually counterintuitive and
mm,
go against a lot of the the pervading mantras. So,
yeah.
if I look at sort of, people that work really hard, right? People that pull all nighters,
Mm,
that sort of logic. That's what
mm,
we need to do to make business. Actually, that leads you to make terrible. If you're back to your point, if you're
mhm,
tired, you make terrible decisions. If you're
mhm,
not looking after your body, well, your mind will go to rot at some point.
mm,
Sitting there working 24/7 isn't healthy.
mm,
Going for a wall, doing pointless things, we've all had shower thoughts and whatever else.
mhm,
Those things don't seem at all logical. And I think it
mhm,
points to the fact that humans are not logical creatures, right? We know that. So a lot of the challenge, I think, of what you're pointing out is that many of the processes that we have for
mm.
making decisions in a formal context actually don't help that. Right. It is
Yeah.
about let's make it that do we need to do this
Mm.
quickly? We need to do this now.
Yes.
We
Yeah.
need to
Yeah.
max it. The way we
Yeah.
get the best out of our human capital, and even that term tells you something,
Mm,
is to, well, let's work them harder because we will,
mm,
if I can get an extra hour's worth of quote unquote productivity, then that's good. Whereas actually having someone switching off for a bit might produce a much better decision. They'll be working through their subconscious or whatever. So in some respects, the things that you're talking about go against conventional wisdom in the
mm.
loosest possible sense of the word. So that's a little bit of a challenge, I guess.
Yeah, it is. It is. And it's that sort of thing like, okay, people, we have a problem. We need to let's be creative now. Three, two, one, get creative. Boom. It doesn't work like that. Right? So you've got to prime, you've got to try different, you've got to get people out of their environment. See, the environment in which we're in is a huge factor in how well we make decisions. All these things, the mind works in strange ways. So going for walks, all of these things, it is counterintuitive. That's why I do call it a practice and it's not a process. So I've started to really correct people when they ask me to describe my decision-making process. And there are processes, there are tools, but it's not it's a practice. And I think we need to build in moments, where we just allow serendipity to strike, go for a walk and maybe nothing happens and that's okay too. John Cleese has talked about that over these. You need some time every day just to sit there and just be creative and just think and see what might hit you. There are lots of times when that is required. There are times when the opposite is required. We know what we need to do. We need to get on with it. And I think a good practice also recognizes that. But that is, as you say, that is a challenge because we have this is some, particularly in the business world, where we think we can put a process around everything and we can control for all the variables and you can't. And so that's something that is, I think increasingly leaders need to understand that because their futures are on the line you this sort of old thinking of controlling all the variables is it's just not it's not good enough. The world isn't going to be very forgiving around that. It's fine to have your internal whatever decision making creativity process or whatever you call it, but um, things will come out of the blue that we can't control, and that requires humility, requires curiosity, requires lots of courage, and that's part of the practice. So some of what I talk about are things like that. And psychological safety is something I talk an awful lot about because you need to get, it's one thing to have a diverse team or workforce, but you need to get them, get diversity, get the benefits of it, get people to speak up in different ways. And so there are multiple ways of doing things, and finding the right practice for you is essential. I argue that it's almost a non-negotiable. We need to think about the world differently, a lot differently, and creativity is a huge part of it. But it, uh, some people get it and some people don't, and some people are receptive and some people maybe less so.
I think the way you paint it is and my mind races to Hamilton, the room where it happened. So there's decisions that things, and obviously there are certain rooms where decisions are made, but often decision making isn't just a process. Let's sit in a meeting. We know this. With anyone who's been to a meeting will know that what is discussed in the meeting is only part of that. Right? Often things are
Yeah.
pre-cooked
Mm,
beforehand, or the person chairing the meeting will. I'll use a
mm.
polite term. It's often not nudge the meeting in a particular
Yeah.
direction. So we have these formal constructs. If you where are
Mm,
decisions made? Well, they're made in the room. They're made by these
mm,
people. But actually, there's a ton of other factors. And so I love it when you bring in, for example, psychological safety to think about. Well, actually, it's not just about what happens in that meeting room. It is about how do we deal with
mm,
it when things go wrong, right? Not
mm,
if, but when things go wrong. How do we handle that? How do we handle
mm,
failure? How do we recognize that? And so the ecosystem of the culture that we have and the way we talk about these things is
mm.
a huge factor in the process that goes on. And so I like this idea of you taking it away from here is a flow chart. And if you follow this
Yeah.
flow chart
Yeah.
or this model or this whatever, you'll get the
Mm,
right answer. What I think you're saying is look, recognize, back to the studio. This is an art, and we will have to flex it according to the sort of decision that we're making. Of
mhm,
course, we're not, back to the decision about who you marry. That is not the same
mhm.
decision as which property do I buy. Right? There,
Yeah.
there are
Mm,
different emotions coming into play. There may be interrelated
mm,
decisions, of course, in that case, but
mhm,
there's if and so I like this. You're thinking about the wider ecosystem as well, and you're
mhm.
recognizing the human dynamics that are there and the variables that we
Yeah.
have. And so,
Mm,
yeah, unfortunately for you, what this points towards is this
mm,
is a lot
mm.
harder, right? I think people
It's
would
all
love
very
it
hard.
if they could come to
Mm,
you and go, let's have Ben's decision making course, right?
mm.
And we'll spend a
Yeah.
couple of hours
Yeah.
with Ben and then we'll work out how to make the job done.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think what you're saying is the support mechanisms around that. And
Mm,
it's much more than just what goes on in that room,
mm.
or it's the broader bit that's absolutely significant here.
Yeah, it's very hard, but I'm also quite hopeful because I think there are a number of factors in the world
Thank God,
that
because I didn't want to
are
finish things off on a negative.
yeah, no. There are a number of factors in the world that that play into what I'm talking about, and that also, those who might embrace or at least try out a decision making practice could benefit from. And one is all the kind of the negative stuff out there in terms of climate change and geopolitics and all this stuff that kind of meshes together and makes it very difficult to actually predict anything. So we can't predict everything. And it sort of feels like to lots of leaders, we've had the pandemic and there's climate change stuff and there's Ukraine. It's like, what's the next thing? It's like, well, there's going to be another thing. Don't, you can sort of predict it maybe, but just know that there's going to be another thing that throws you off. And so,
I sort of love that because it's like I've had enough of these things, right? Make these
yeah, yeah.
things
It's like,
go
good.
away.
Yeah.
And to your
Yeah.
point, it's not. I think we have to accept that it reminds me of those like some of those sort of bartender games where
Mm,
there's more and more beers or drinks being thrown down the
mm,
bar, and the game just keeps going, right? And so I
yeah.
think we have to recognize that that's there. We can't control
Yeah.
this stuff. And I
Yeah.
do think that what's interesting post pandemic, there's a kind of like, oh, enough of this stuff now. That was really difficult. But
Yeah.
now and now
Now we're
there's all
back to
these other
normal.
things,
Yeah.
back to
Yeah.
normal, back to
Yeah.
what but
Mm,
normal was never there in the first
mm,
place.
that's right. And so that's what the pandemic revealed to us. And the more that people are hanging on to this belief that we'll go back to some sort of normal, stable state, that I don't think that those people will be in leadership positions for that much longer. So I think there's that. There's all the stuff that's happening around AI and machine learning, which I think there are downsides to it, but one of the upsides is I think that makes all the stuff that's human about us really interesting and really valuable. All that creativity and curiosity, and if we can outsource all the drudgery to machines, then that should free us up. But also we do need to think differently and creatively about solving problems. And that only happens if we lean into that sort of uncertainty, that creativity, and collaborate in new ways. And that is what I'm talking about. That's what I'm teaching people to do and to lean into that uncertainty. We don't have the answers to climate change, to societal polarization, but the more that we try certain things and learn, then the closer we'll get to some of those answers. Uh, we can't prescribe it. So I think there are a number of trends out there, and also the way that we work, and the recognition that hybrid working is probably here to stay and is valuable. The all of the stuff around diversity, there are lots of benefits around having cognitive diversity, neurodiversity in the workplace. I think those are all positive things, and are they coincide and they support what I'm trying to do an awful lot. So it's difficult, but I think that the forces of the world are really driving us to embrace a different kind of approach. And so that's why I think the art and the science and the practice of good decision making, quality decision making, I think it is, and maybe this is my confirmation bias, but it is leading towards a decision quality revolution, which I think is something that we need.
Love it, love it, love it. So, if people want to find out more about this revolution, Ben, to join you on the
Yeah.
mission, remind us of all the things that you do and how people can find you.
Sure. Well, the company is the Decision Making Studio. So it's the decisionmaking.studio is the website, and you can learn about decision making there, and you can get in touch with me. You can follow me on LinkedIn, Ben Cattaneo. My podcast is called All Things Risk for now. We might change that in the future, but if you search for All Things Risk wherever you get your podcasts, or also at the decisionmaking.studio website, you'll find that there. And yeah, just get in touch. And I'm very happy to chat. And if anyone wants to pick up the conversation a little bit more, or if anyone's interested in training on decision making, just drop me a DM, and we'll have a chat. And I'm sure we can have a great follow-on conversation.
Amazing. Well, links as ever to all of those things in the show notes. Ben, it's always a real pleasure to talk to you because
Mhm.
you're very thoughtful, but you're really engaging in the way you think about it and incredibly realistic about the world. And one of the things I love
Mhm.
is that this isn't some sort of delusional framework that's, slavish that pretends to solve all the problems. This is about just
Yeah.
making us better at a skill that we can all benefit from. And what I love about it is it's useful in your personal life as well as at work. So
Mm.
this is good investment in the time. But as people say, it's also a lot of fun. I think, one of the things that
True.
you approach it with all with a
Yeah.
sense of humor and a wry smile, which is always why it's a pleasure to talk to you. So thank you for inspiring me to think differently about decision making, but also for being a fabulous return guest on the show.
Mm. Thanks, Christian. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to Ben for appearing and to you for listening. If you missed the first part of the series with Dr. Melina Moleskis, there's a link to that in the show notes, and you can hear her insights on decision making there. To find out more about Ben, the Decision Making Studio, what is currently known as the All Things Risk podcast, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a review or rating of it on whichever platform you're listening to this on, please do. It really, really does help to amplify the show, get new listeners, and therefore enable me to continue to attract high-quality guests. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, you can visit the show's website, humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, and you never know, that might also be about decision making. So I'll see you for that. But in the meantime, continue to try to make great decisions, stay safe, and above all, thank you so much for listening.